Every empire that ever fell made the same mistake. They optimized for efficiency over resilience. They built systems so lean, so perfectly calibrated, that a single disruption could cascade through the entire structure and bring it down. Rome perfected grain shipments from Egypt until harvest failure meant starvation. Britain built global supply chains so efficient that a canal blockage could paralyze industry. And now the modern world has created the most efficient, most fragile system in human history. On January 28, 2026, a single container ship ran aground in the Panama Canal. The MSC Istanbul, carrying 24,000 containers, lodged sideways in the Gatun locks. Within 6 hours, 127 ships were backed up on both sides. Within 48 hours, global shipping rates doubled. Within a week, automotive plants in 3 countries began shutting down production lines because they couldn't get the semiconductors they needed. One ship, one canal. Global industrial paralysis. This is not about transportation infrastructure failing. This is about what happens when you build civilization on the assumption that nothing will ever go wrong. And history tells us that assumption is always catastrophic. The surface explanation seems manageable. The Panama Canal handles 14,000 ships per year carrying $270 billion in cargo. When weather, accidents, or maintenance create delays, shipping companies reroute around Cape Horn or through Suez. Costs increase, delivery times extend, but commerce continues. This is how global trade has adapted to disruptions for decades. But that explanation assumes alternatives exist. It assumes capacity margins. It assumes that when one route fails, others can absorb the overflow. These assumptions worked when global supply chains had redundancy built in, when companies kept inventory, when production systems could handle temporary shortages without complete shutdown. The modern economy eliminated those assumptions. Just-in-time manufacturing means inventory levels measured in hours, not months. Lean supply chains means single-source suppliers for critical components. Global optimization means parts crossing multiple borders before final assembly. The system works perfectly when everything works perfectly. When something breaks, everything breaks. The MSC Istanbul incident exposed how thin these margins have become. Automotive manufacturers shut down assembly lines because they couldn't get semiconductor chips for 3 days. 3 days. These are companies producing millions of vehicles annually, but they cannot operate for 72 hours without continuous component delivery. Electronics manufacturers in Asia began rationing allocation to customers because shipping delays created artificial scarcity in components that aren't actually scarce. The components exist. The ships carrying them are sitting in Panama waiting for a canal passage. But modern supply chain management cannot distinguish between real shortage and logistical delay. Both trigger the same response: production cuts and allocation restrictions. This is not efficiency. This is fragility disguised as optimization. We have seen this pattern destroy previous civilizations, not through invasion or natural disaster, but through the collapse of systems that became too complex and too interdependent to survive disruption. Rome built the most sophisticated supply chain in the ancient world. Egyptian grain fed the capital. Spanish silver funded the legions. Germanic timber built the ships. Gallic wool clothed the citizens. The system was magnificent in its scope and efficiency. Rome could support a population of 1 million people through coordinated production and distribution across 3 continents. But efficiency created dependency. When Germanic tribes disrupted timber supplies, Roman shipbuilding capacity declined. When North African harvests failed, grain riots threatened political stability. When Spanish silver mines were exhausted, currency debasement triggered inflation. Each optimization created a new vulnerability. Each dependency created a potential failure point. The crisis came not from external enemies overrunning Roman defenses, but from internal systems becoming too complex to maintain. The administrative cost of coordinating supply chains across vast distances consumed increasing resources. The military cost of protecting trade routes absorbed larger portions of imperial revenue. The logistical complexity of managing interdependent systems exceeded Roman institutional capacity. By the 4th century, the Western Empire was spending 75% of its revenue on military and administrative costs just to maintain the supply systems that made Roman civilization possible. When Germanic pressure increased and supply lines became unreliable, the mathematics became impossible. The empire couldn't maintain the system that supported its population. Collapse followed within decades. Britain repeated the pattern with industrial precision. By 1900, British industry depended on cotton from America, wool from Australia, silk from China, rubber from Malaysia. British agriculture produced only 40% of domestic food requirements. The rest came from global supply chains managed through London financial markets and protected by the Royal Navy. This created unprecedented efficiency. British factories could access raw materials from optimal global sources. British consumers could buy products manufactured with components from wherever they could be produced most cheaply. British capital could optimize returns across global markets. The system generated wealth that made Britain the dominant global power for a century. But dependency grew with prosperity. When German U-boats disrupted Atlantic shipping in 1917, Britain faced starvation within months. The island that ruled global commerce couldn't feed its own population without continuous imports. The country that dominated global industry couldn't manufacture basic products without foreign raw materials. The efficiency that made Britain powerful also made it vulnerable. Each optimization reduced resilience. Each global connection created potential disruption. When those disruptions came simultaneously during the World Wars, British global dominance ended not through military defeat, but through the collapse of supply systems that had become too expensive and too vulnerable to maintain. The United States learned these lessons and initially built redundancy into its economic systems. Multiple steel producers, multiple automotive manufacturers, multiple technology companies, regional industrial centers that could function independently, strategic stockpiles of critical materials, supply chain diversity that reduced dependency on single sources or routes. But over 50 years, American industry optimized away that redundancy. Manufacturing migrated to lowest-cost global locations. Supply chains consolidated around most efficient producers. Inventory management eliminated stockpiles in favor of just-in-time delivery. The result was unprecedented efficiency and unprecedented fragility. Today, 90% of pharmaceutical ingredients used in American medicine are manufactured in China and India. 75% of rare earth elements critical to defense systems come from Chinese supply chains. 60% of semiconductors that power everything from cars to refrigerators are manufactured in Taiwan and South Korea. The United States depends on potential adversaries for materials essential to basic societal function. This dependency was manageable when global systems operated smoothly, when shipping ran on schedule, when borders stayed open, when suppliers remained reliable. But the Panama Canal incident revealed what happens when those assumptions break down. Critical systems fail not because of sabotage or attack, but because optimization eliminated the margins needed to handle normal disruptions. The cascade effects are accelerating. Semiconductor shortages triggered by shipping delays are forcing automotive manufacturers to reduce production schedules for the remainder of 2026. Electronics companies are implementing allocation systems that prioritize largest customers, effectively rationing supply to smaller businesses. Chemical manufacturers dependent on feedstocks transported through Panama are raising prices preemptively to manage demand destruction. These are rational responses to supply uncertainty, but they compound the original disruption. Production cuts reduce economic activity. Allocation systems create artificial scarcity. Price increases destroy demand. The efficiency that was supposed to optimize resource allocation becomes a transmission mechanism for systemic breakdown. Modern financial systems amplify these disruptions through mechanisms that didn't exist during previous historical collapses. Just-in-time manufacturing requires just-in-time financing. Credit facilities calibrated to normal cash flow patterns. Inventory financing based on predictable turnover rates. Working capital management that assumes continuous operations. When supply chain disruptions interrupt normal business operations, companies face immediate financing stress. Revenue drops when production stops, but fixed costs continue. Credit facilities designed for steady-state operations become inadequate when disruptions extend cash conversion cycles. Banking relationships based on predictable cash flows become strained when uncertainty increases. The financial system's response to supply chain stress creates additional disruption. Credit tightening when companies most need flexibility. Higher borrowing costs when margins are already compressed. Reduced trade financing when letters of credit become more expensive. Each financial adaptation to supply chain uncertainty makes the underlying disruption worse. This dynamic was visible within days of the Panama Canal blockage. Trade financing costs increased by 30% for shipments with uncertain delivery dates. Working capital credit lines faced increased scrutiny from banks concerned about inventory financing risks. Smaller companies with limited financing alternatives began reducing orders preemptively to preserve cash flow. These responses are individually rational. Banks protect themselves by reducing exposure to supply chain risk. Companies protect themselves by reducing commitments they might not be able to fulfill. But collectively, these protective measures accelerate the transition from temporary disruption to systemic breakdown. The mathematical reality is that efficiency and resilience are inversely related. Every optimization that reduces costs also reduces margins for error. Every consolidation that improves productivity also creates single points of failure. Every integration that enhances coordination also increases complexity and interdependence. Modern civilization has optimized to a degree that previous empires never attempted. Global supply chains with components crossing multiple borders before final assembly. Financial systems where local disruptions trigger global consequences within hours. Information networks where localized failures cascade through interconnected systems immediately. The efficiency gains from this optimization have been extraordinary. Products cheaper and more sophisticated than any previous generation could imagine. Information available instantly across global networks. Capital allocated to highest return opportunities regardless of geography. Standards of living that would appear miraculous to previous centuries. But the resilience costs have been equally extraordinary. Supply chains so lean that minor disruptions cause major failures. Financial systems so interconnected that local problems become global crises. Societies so dependent on optimal functioning that any deviation from normal operations triggers cascading breakdowns. The Panama Canal blockage lasted 8 days. 8 days of ships waiting to cross a waterway that handles 6% of global trade. That temporary delay caused production shutdowns, supply allocation, and financial stress that continued for months after normal canal operations resumed. The disruption was brief. The consequences were systemic. This pattern is accelerating as global systems become more optimized and more fragile. Climate change increases the frequency of weather events that disrupt transportation networks. Geopolitical tensions create uncertainty that complicates supply chain management. Technological complexity increases the number of potential failure points in interconnected systems. Each new optimization reduces the margin for error a little more. Each new efficiency eliminates redundancy that might buffer future shocks. Each new integration creates dependencies that could become vulnerabilities when assumptions about stable operation prove incorrect. The history of civilizational collapse teaches us that complex systems don't fail gradually. They work until they don't. Efficiency improvements continue until marginal gains create systemic fragility. Optimization proceeds until the system becomes too lean to survive normal variations in operating conditions. Rome's supply chains worked perfectly until they didn't. British global trade operated efficiently until it couldn't. Modern just-in-time manufacturing functions optimally until something disrupts the assumptions that make optimization possible. When that happens, efficiency becomes the mechanism of breakdown rather than the source of prosperity. The Panama Canal blockage was not the cause of systemic stress. It was the revelation that systemic stress already existed, hidden beneath optimization that looked like strength, but was actually brittleness. The ship that ran aground didn't break the global economy. It exposed how close to breaking the global economy already was. And this is only the beginning. The incident in Panama was managed and resolved within days, but each efficiency optimization makes the next disruption more dangerous. Each redundancy elimination reduces the system's ability to absorb unexpected stress. Each complexity increase multiplies the ways things can go wrong. Climate disruption will increase the frequency of infrastructure failures. Geopolitical competition will increase the probability of supply chain weaponization. Technological complexity will increase the number of ways that efficient systems can become inefficient very quickly. The empires that fell before us thought their supply systems were sources of strength, right up until they became sources of collapse. The efficiency that makes modern civilization possible is following the same trajectory, working perfectly until it doesn't. Optimizing continuously until optimization becomes the problem rather than the solution. The event isn't a warning, the fragility is. Systems don't collapse because they're attacked. They collapse because they're too efficient to survive disruption. And the more optimized they become, the smaller the disruption required to bring them down.